What's going on, everyone? This is Tyro May here, Himalaya ride enthusiast and entrepreneur. I'm back here once again as I bring you chapter 15 from my book, The Himalaya, where the strobe flashes and the mirror ball spins. Continuation of my story on how my fascination with the Himalaya ride started, which leads me to my journey to one day call one of those classic rides of my very own. So if you'd like to purchase a copy, you get it on Amazon or my online store. We can get some Himalaya fan-based merch, just like this. Web address is shown below the screen. So without further ado, I'm going to take you to chapter 15, titled Public Exposure. Woo. February was finally here, which meant it was almost time for the model contest at the hobby shop. I spent the last few months trying to get my model into tip-top shape. It was my first model contest, so I had to make sure everything worked perfectly. I tested all the lighting and the sounds for the music and siren effect, and of course I tested the model itself, making sure that it put out its highest performance. The day before the contest, I gave my Himalaya model one last test run before packing everything, including the extension cords, my lighting controller, and my portable stereo system where my speakers for my model plug in. I woke up the next morning around 7 o'clock after only sleeping for about 3 hours due to the excitement I felt throughout the night while thinking about that big day. After I showered and got dressed, I packed my model and everything that went along with it into my truck and headed out the door around 8 o'clock. I left the house earlier than I needed to, so I stopped and got some breakfast before I made my way to the hobby shop, which opened around 9 a.m. I showed up about 15 minutes early. When the doors finally opened, I was ready and anxious to get everything set up before showtime. I opened the trunk and started to carry my model inside. The shop owner was nice enough to open the door for me. "What the hell is that?" he asked me with a strange reaction. I introduced the shop owner to my masterpiece and gave him a little history. My arms were getting tired from carrying the model, so I asked him where I could set everything up. Now, I hoped for a large table so I could have plenty of room for not only my model, but for my controller for the lights and my portable stereo system as well. The shop owner suggested that I set up everything on the counter so it would be the first thing everyone saw as they walked in. It felt kind of awkward to set up on a counter because there wasn't enough room for everything, but I had to make do. After I placed my Himalaya model on the counter, I set up all the equipment. I tested everything on my model, from the lighting to running the model at both speeds to make sure everything ran perfectly. I treated my Himalaya model as if I was running the real thing by testing everything out before the opening day of the state fair. Just like the real Himalaya ride, my model would be shown to the public, so I had to make sure my ride ran well with no flaws. I was the first one to arrive, so there was plenty of time for some last-minute adjustments. After giving my Himalaya model its first test run of the day, I plugged in the speakers from the model in my portable stereo system and played some music. My Himalaya model was officially open to the public. The shop owner came to me and was really impressed with what he saw. He asked me how I became so interested in the Himalaya ride and how long I've been building these kind of models. As I was telling him how it all began, some customers spotted me and my model and came over to check it out. Soon after, some gentlemen who were entering the contest came in and started setting up their exhibits. After they were finished setting up, they came by to meet me and check out my model. As more people came over to me and my model, I was ready to start the first show of the day. It would be just like the real ride cycle, which was how I always operated my model. I started the model by running it slowly as I changed the lighting. I killed the white lights and turned on the spinning colorful disco lights, which were attached to the front of the model, along with the spotlight that was aimed at the spinning mirror ball that swirled white beams of light inside the model. I turned up the speed and flipped the switch that worked the strobe light and played the cassette tape with the recording of the siren effect. Everyone was stunned as they watched my model put on its amazing show. I worked the model with the same ride cycle all through the day. I would start off slowly, then speed it up and turn on the strobe light and siren effect, then slow it back down and let it rest for a minute or two before starting it all over again. As I operated my model throughout the day, more spectators came by as well as the judges. They all reacted in pure amazement as they watched my model perform in such glory. The model contest was an all-day event. I had so much fun showing off my hard work and meeting new people, including one of the judges named Christian, who was the most impressed with my work and wanted to know more about me and my personal interests and how it all began. Hours later, it was finally time for the award ceremony, which started around 5 p.m. I shut on all the lights on my model before it began. There were awards for different model categories, including Best Aircraft Model, Best Race Car Model, Best Military-Related Model, etc. There was even an award which I thought was a shoo-in for Best Miscellaneous Model, but unfortunately I lost in that category as well. However, I wasn't too upset. I was just happy that I finally had a chance to display my model to the public, and the positive reaction I had received from everyone felt really rewarding to me, and that was all that really mattered. Suddenly out of nowhere, another category was announced: Most Original and Best Displayed Model. As the announcer revealed the winner, I found out that the award went to me and my Himalaya model. My mouth dropped as I received my award, as well as a standing ovation, which was definitely the icing on the cake. After the award ceremony came to an end, I started packing up my model and all the extension cords. People came by and shook my hand, telling me what a great job I'd done. After I packed everything in my truck, I was so stoked from winning my first award that I couldn't go home just yet. I was still floating on cloud nine from finally having a chance to show off my hard work to the public and winning an award to top it all off, so I had to somehow celebrate my victory. So instead, I stayed in Dover at the mall for the rest of the evening, where I visited some people I knew and shared my good news. The next week after the model contest, my boss gave me a special project to do. She noticed how good I was with art, so she wanted me to paint a mural on the walls of the party areas in the snack bar, which was quite an honor. About 90% of the mural was to be focused on roller skating and birthday parties, but my boss also suggested that I draw something special on one of the walls. One of the other managers actually suggested that I paint a mural of kids riding the Himalaya, which I thought was kind of odd. Believe it or not, I wasn't 100% sure about that idea at first, because even though I had introduced everyone to my personal hobby based on the ride, in the back of my mind, I still felt that I needed to keep my hobby and my job separate. But I started thinking about it a little more, and then I felt that everyone should know about my interests. Painting a mural of the Himalaya would give them something to remember me by when I finally had a chance to move on to bigger and better things someday. I went home and started drawing some pictures of the roller skating mascot, which was a kangaroo on skates, along with some kids with balloons, confetti, and other birthday party details. I also took the time to design a picture of a cartoon-like version of a Himalaya ride with kids riding on it. When I got to work the next day, I showed my boss my drawings that I would be using for the murals. Also, the head manager already had some ideas about painting the murals. He suggested that we use fluorescent colors because he planned on installing black lights in the party areas. Therefore, the murals would glow. I thought it was a cool idea. My head manager told me that he would bring in the projector he had rented so I could use it to start the tracing. I told him I'd be there first thing in the morning to get started. I left work around at 3 o'clock, which is my usual time during my maintenance hours on weekdays. After work, I made a detour over to my father's house to find some more photos of the Himalaya on the internet for my scrapbook. I also went to the used ride site to find out if the Super Himalaya was still up for grabs, even though I knew it would be nearly impossible to get that kind of money, especially when it came to playing the Powerball, which I played every time I had a chance and still come up with nothing. But I couldn't help but to still have hope. However, I was getting tired of dreaming year after year and was ready and willing to do anything to finally make my dream come true. On the used ride section, I saw photos of all the used rides, but surprisingly, the Super Himalaya wasn't there anymore. My heart sank and I went to a frenzy. Without any hesitation, I wrote to the company and asked them what had happened to the Himalaya. I had hoped to God that the ride hadn't been sold yet. The next morning, I couldn't help but wonder about what happened to the Super Himalaya, but I had to switch gears because it was time to go to work and start my big project. The projector was up and ready for me to begin the tracing process of the murals. My head manager gave me some pencils to use for all the tracing I would be doing for many hours. During my lunch break, I decided to rush back over to my father's house with the hope of finding out what happened to the Himalaya ride and whether my chance of one day calling that ride my very own had passed. I had been thinking about that ride since the previous day, so the suspense was killing me. I only had a half-hour break, so I couldn't take too long. I jumped out of my truck, rushed over to my father's house, and turned on the computer. After I logged on, I immediately checked my email to see if I had any kind of response from the company. As I clicked on the email icon, I noticed that the company had responded to me with the information about the Himalaya ride. I found out that the company had indeed sold the ride to the lucky buyer, which really made me lose my appetite. It was time for me to go back to work, so I turned off the computer right away and left the house. As I went back to spending the rest of the day tracing out those huge drawings, I couldn't help but feel angry and depressed about the whole Himalaya situation as the devastation continues festering inside of me as I watched my childhood dream crush right in front of my eyes. I felt so badly that I actually thought about giving up my childhood dream of owning a Himalaya ride for good, as well as my hobby based on my love for the ride. I was ready and willing to just give it all up, until suddenly out of nowhere, I began having thoughts about a video I once saw of a song by Boyz II Men titled, "I Will Get There." Especially the part when they say, "So don't tell me that it's over, 'cause each step just gets me closer." The more that song got stuck in my head, the more I wanted to fight for my dream. I began to feel really foolish about even thinking about giving up everything that I had lived for all of these years. That following Friday night, the rink was having one of their monthly all-night skating specials, which were usually from 7 in the evening until 7 in the morning. On these all-night specials, there were 2 different DJs, one for the first half, from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m., and then me, who took over until 7 a.m. I showed up for work a couple of hours early to talk to everybody before I started my shift. That entire week, I had been thinking about that Boyz II Men song a lot, so I had to hear it somehow. I went up to the booth to where my friend Jim played the music until it was my time to take over. I mentioned the Boyz II Men song to him, which I got out, and made a request for him to play it for me before I started my shift. A few songs later, he played the song during the couples skate. When the song came on, my heart suddenly skipped a beat. As I stood there listening to the song word for word, I stared sappily at the spinning mirror balls hanging from the middle of the ceiling and thought about my lifelong journey. Every word from that song was exactly what I was going through to that very day. I was willing to do whatever it took to make my childhood dream come true, even if it took the rest of my life, because I just couldn't give it all up. Not now, not ever. I went back over to my father's house the following week to look for some more Himalaya rides online that were either for sale or just had some cool photos for my scrapbook. I visited another website that sold both new and used rides. This particular site had all sorts of used rides that were listed in alphabetical order from the Alibaba to the Zipper. Of course, I scrolled down to the H's to see if any of the used Himalaya rides were for sale. There were quite a few Himalaya rides for sale, and each ride had different prices on them. But none of the rides had any photos. So I wrote to the company and asked for some photos of the used Himalaya rides and gave them my address, just like I had when I wrote to the amusement park in Texas. A month later, I looked inside the mailbox and found a large envelope from the used ride company. I rushed back into the house and ripped open the envelope to see if all the used Himalaya rides that were for sale. To my surprise, none of the Himalaya rides in the photos were the original type built by Revachon. The Himalaya rides in these photos looked rather generic. The rides had some duplications of the original Himalaya ride, such as the tunnel with the snow-themed artwork. One of the rides even had a mirror ball in the center, but none of the features looked anything like the Himalaya that I was used to seeing and always admired. Since I had a new vehicle that was in much better condition, I made plans to drive to Ocean City by myself for the first time. I had Ocean City on my mind one day, so I took the time to search online to see if Trippers Rides had a website so I could write to them about the Himalaya ride. I found their website, which mentioned their park along with their rides and everything else the park had in store. I decided to write to Trippers Rides. I told them about myself and how I was a fan of the Himalaya ride and how I was thankful that they still had it up and running after all these years. I also had some questions about the responsibilities of owning a Himalaya ride, such as the maintenance and electricity. After I finished my letter, I clicked the send icon and went back to finding more photos of the Himalaya rides from my scrapbook. I had a response from the park the next day as I stopped to check my email. The letter informed me that the Himalaya was owned by a gentleman named Glenn, who would be the ideal person to talk to about my questions. Since I had plans to visit the park that summer, I decided to wait until I got there to speak with the ride's owner. About a month later, I had another email from Trippers asking me for my home address because I was to receive a gift. I immediately gave him my address and anxiously wondered about the gift I was to receive. About 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the park that included a blue card. The letter stated that they were so grateful to have such a devoted fan of the Himalaya ride, and to show their appreciation, they awarded me with a pass for a wristband to ride for free until 6 p.m. The letter also suggested that I should use the wristband to ride the Himalayas many times as I wished. Things were finally starting to go my way for a change. Later that month, I was visiting my job at the roller rink one Saturday night when I spotted a familiar face. It was none other than my good friend Hilton, who I hadn't seen since 1999 when he decided to travel with the carnival. Right away, I went to him, shook his hand, and welcomed him back. Hilton was one of the only real friends I had in such a long time, so I was more than happy that he had come back. I had a lot of questions about his experience traveling from place to place, not to mention about constantly setting up and tearing out those huge rides all the time. Hilton told me that about all the rides he has set up and operated during this experience. He admitted that it was hard at first, but then he started to gradually get used to the whole routine. Hilton told me that he had had a lot of fun with the carnival, but now he was home for good. It was cool to see my friend again after 2 years. I finally had someone with whom to hang out and go places, and just in time for the summer season. Since I had received my new vehicle, I had plans to drive to Ocean City for the first time. I had also made plans to go on the weekend vacation to a resort town, so it was only right to invite my closest friend to tag along. I had finally finished the murals for the party areas in the snack bar, which took about 2 months. The black lights were installed, and they gave the mural a brilliant effect. One day I decided to add some last details to the murals. I was soon interrupted by the assistant manager who told me I had a phone call. Wondering who it could be, I answered the phone. To my surprise, it was the local news. They wanted to interview me. I never thought in a million years I would see myself on television for anything, but thanks to the assistant manager who had set up the whole thing, it was like a dream come true. The news reporter told me that she would stop by the next Wednesday at 3 o'clock to visit me. I hung up the phone. With a huge smile, I thanked my manager for setting up this deal for me. She suggested I bring in my Himalaya model, which I already had planned to do anyway. I felt a little bit of nervous energy, but I was really looking forward to this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Not only I would be on television, I would also have the chance to show everyone my special talents. Most importantly, everyone who normally saw me on a weekly basis will soon find out that there was a whole lot more to me than just my job at the rink, which most who see me on a daily basis think that, at least in their mind, that what I do at my job was the only thing I'm good at and what I would probably do for the rest of my life, which was never the case. Now I felt I would have this golden opportunity to finally prove them wrong. Early that following week, I started working on my model. I was getting it ready for the public once again and making sure it looked and performed just like it had at the model contest. This time, however, my model would be making its television debut, so it had to be perfect. I was testing out the performance of the model when I noticed that the motor on the turntable, which made the cars on the model spin, was suddenly starting to die. I had to think of something fast, so I fiddled with the speed button that kept the car spinning, especially when I changed the speed back and forth. I had to be at my job at 12:45 the next afternoon for a 6 and under skating program, which usually lasts about an hour and a half. Since I had to set up my model before my interview, I decided to leave the house an hour early so I would have plenty of time to set up and test my model. I only had so much time to set up because people started to arrive with their children. I ended up having to both hand out skates and get my model ready, so I was literally bouncing back and forth over the wall from the skate counter to the party area where I had my model set up. Finally, the manager jumped in to help so I can get everything ready for the interview. I went back to the party area to set up my model and test out the motor and lights to make sure everything worked perfectly. Unfortunately, I was still having trouble with the motor, but I had it under control just in time for the interview. Then, as I tested out the lighting, I discovered that my white boarding lights had stopped working. Even though it was a minor problem, I took it seriously because I wanted everything on my model to be flawless. The strobe, the sign, and every other light on the model was working, but I guess the boarding lights decided to take a day off, and with such terrible timing. Nevertheless, I had to make do. As I continued to test out my model, some of the parents who were there with their children came by to see what I was up to. I explained that I was going to be on the local news and I wanted to make sure everything went without a hitch. Around 2:30 that afternoon, the news reporter and the cameraman arrived. I felt a little anxious and my stomach was in knots, but I was ready to get on with the interview. The news reporter met with me and I introduced myself. Everybody else was clearing the building since the Sit and Under program had wrapped up for the day. As soon as everybody left, it was time to start the interview, so we sat down at one of the tables. The cameraman started recording and a big, bright, hot light shone on me. The first question the reporter asked was about my job at the rink and everything I had learned from it. The next subject was about the mural that I painted in the party areas and how long it took for me to complete the whole project. Last but not least, she asked about my Himalaya model, which I happily demonstrated for her, and most importantly, the camera. She asked me about my interest in the Himalaya ride and how it all got started. I explained to her that I've been interested in the Himalaya ever since I first laid eyes on the ride at the state fair and have been hooked ever since. I also told her about the time I worked on the ride at the fair back in 1997. I mentioned my visit to the Himalaya ride at Trimper's Rides in Ocean City, Maryland, and I revealed to her about my lifelong dream of owning a Himalaya ride someday. The news reporter then asked me why I liked the Himalaya so much and why the ride was so special to me. I explained to her that it was just something about that ride and the way it's designed that just drew my attention, including the artwork, the lighting, the giant spinning mirror ball in the center, and the speed and the movement of it all. Every time I ride it, it felt like everything was right with the world, especially if the right song came on. The news reporter seemed very impressed with my answer as well as my interesting hobby, and she asked me some last questions. The reporter wanted to know if I had any other talents, such as singing, dancing, or if I played any kind of sports. I mentioned to the reporter that I couldn't do any of those things, and as a result, she seemed sort of surprised. I wasn't sure if it was because I was a young African-American male, which meant I was automatically capable of being some kind of entertainer or athlete, which isn't necessarily true. There's a lot more out there than just playing sports and making music, especially if it's not your forte. Not everyone can sing, dance, or be athletic. There were some of us, like me, who have that one special talent and a unique hobby that is original. All in all, the news reporter was very impressed with me and the interview was successful. The reporter shook my hand and I started to pack up my model. She told me the interview would air early Sunday morning around 8:30. I told her I planned on recording it, so I got up early that Sunday morning and turned on the news. I got a blank videotape and had it set up to record my interview. After the commercial break, which consisted mostly of local car dealerships, the news came on, and the same reporter who had visited me a few days earlier was on. She introduced my interview and I pushed the record button as the interview aired. As I watched myself on television for the first time, I started to feel overwhelmed with nervousness and excitement. I hoped that I hadn't made a fool of myself. I'd never been on television before, so I didn't know what the hell to think at first. The first half of the interview was about my job and the mural I painted in the party area. The second half was about my personal interest in the Himalaya ride. As soon as they showed my Himalaya model on television, I damn near lost it. I'd never been as happy as I was when I saw my hard work being shown on television for the first time for everyone to see. I felt that I had finally shown everyone what I was all about, and it made me feel that great things were about to happen for me. Anything was possible as long as I had the passion. I was very happy with how the interview turned out. However, there was an error about my age. The reporter mentioned that I was 23 when I was only 21 at the time. Other than that one error, the interview turned out great. I stopped the record button and played the tape to test it out. As I played it back, the interview came out crystal clear. I was so full of energy that I just couldn't sit in the house all day. I had to go out somewhere and celebrate somehow. I decided to take a drive to various places and to visit some of the few friends I had to show them my interview just in case they had missed it. Now, I didn't show them my interview for bragging rights. I really wanted the few friends I had to be proud of me and to have their full support, which I could happily say that they were proud and even wish me the best of luck with what the future may hold for me. The next month, on the day after my 22nd birthday, my boss informed me that there was a carnival being set up at the mall parking lot. I never thought I would see a carnival at the mall, so it was definitely a first. After I was through with work, I called Hilton and told him about the carnival and asked him if he wanted to tag along. I left around 3 o'clock that afternoon, picked up Hilton, and we headed toward the mall. As we reached the parking lot, I noticed it was a pretty impressive selection of rides for such a small carnival. There were bumper cars and a gravitron, as well as some of the traditional rides like the Ferris wheel, merry-go-round, and tilt-a-whirl. Another ride I noticed was the smaller built Music Express, which I hadn't seen since the State Fair in 1999. We parked close to the midway and started walking towards the rides to get a closer look. The carnival wouldn't open for yet another few hours, but Hilton suddenly decided out of nowhere that he wanted to help out at this carnival. I reminded him that he had just returned from traveling with the carnival, so why in the hell did he want to do it all again? Hilton explained to me that he was just going to help out while they were local and wasn't planning on traveling again whatsoever. I thought about it for a minute, and I decided if he was going to work at this carnival, then so would I. I also felt that it would be a great way to make some extra money for our weekend trip to Ocean City I had planned for Memorial Day weekend. I had my heart set on being at that Music Express, where I could hopefully learn to operate the ride and maybe, if I was lucky, talk on the microphone. I've been working on my routine for quite a while. I was hoping to be the next Tim and was ready to put my skills to the test. Though it wasn't the Himalaya, I had to begin somewhere, and I felt it was the perfect time for me to start. We asked one of the workers who we needed to talk to about getting hired. The worker pointed us to a gentleman by the name of Johnny, who was the carnival supervisor at the time. We told Johnny that we were interested in helping out the carnival for the next few days. Johnny asked if we planned to travel, and we both immediately said no. Then he asked if we had any kind of experience with rides or any of that nature. Hilton began telling him about traveling with the carnival, running the rides, setting them up and tearing them down. Hilton spotted the crazy spinning tornado ride and told him that it was one of the many rides that he used to manage. Johnny seemed really impressed with Hilton, but when it was my turn to tell him about my experience with the State Fair in 1997, he refused to listen to anything I had to say. In fact, Johnny kept cutting me off and to talk to Hilton, which I thought was extremely rude and disrespectful because he had never given me a chance to speak. And to make matters worse, Johnny planned to hire Hilton on the spot and give me the brush off. As he gave Hilton the uniform shirt to wear, I told him that he had a chance to to tell him about my experience. After he left me high and dry, he then had the audacity to turn to me and say, "Don't worry, you'll see your buddy again someday." When Johnny decided to rub it in my face right then and there, I finally snapped. But before I had a chance to say what I had in mind, Hilton stepped in and demanded that Johnny hire us both or else he was walking. Thanks to Hilton, Johnny slowly started to come to his senses and tried to find me a shirt to wear. Johnny asked Hilton where he wanted to work, so Hilton asked to be at the tornado. But Johnny never gave me a choice. Instead, he just sent me over to the bumper cars of all things. I was surprised he didn't send me over to the kiddie section. At the bumper cars, I was introduced to a much friendlier individual named Donald, who was the ride's foreman. "Welcome to my ride," he said to me as he shook my hand. Donald may have been happy to have me at his ride, but I, on the other hand, was less than thrilled. I told him that I was actually hoping to be at the Music Express, but even though Johnny gave my friend the ride of his choice, he pretty much threw me over to the bumper cars without even blinking. I told him I couldn't understand why he treated Hilton like his best friend, but treated me like crap. Unlike Johnny, Donald really understood where I was coming from. He informed me that Johnny was the kind of person who had a kind of clique. He liked to hire people of his choice and give everyone else the brush off. so I told Donald that Johnny could just go straight to hell for all I cared. It was enough being an outcast and constantly feeling unwanted back in my high school days, but I never would have thought I would meet such an obnoxious bastard like Johnny as an adult. Just like back in my teenage years when I really didn't have any friends, nor anyone who was really nice to me, and the friends I was lucky to have are the ones who always get accepted by everyone else, while I basically get kicked to the curb. So sadly, this was no different. At the bumper cars, Donald took the time to show me the ropes to running the ride, like checking the height of some children who may not be tall enough to ride, taking everyone's tickets, and introduced me to a couple of other guys with whom I'll be working. The funny part was that most of the time I was at the ride, I was running by myself, which was something I never thought I would have done. So it was quite an experience for having such a raw deal. As I ran the bumper cars, I frequently looked over at the Music Express and thought what could have been. This experience reminded me of the one I had back in the fair in 1997 when I was sent to another ride, but eventually was sent to my dream ride. This time, however, was different. I had to stay at the bumper cars for the next few days, including teardown. The second day I arrived at the carnival after working my steady job at the rink, I decided to bring along my scrapbook to share with Donald and anybody else who was interested in what I was all about. Donald was impressed with the photos I had in the book, which I had found mostly online. Donald finally understood that I wanted to learn how to operate that type of ride to fulfill my interests. But he told me that the former of the Music Express was really picky about the choice of music, which really put a damper on everything. The carnival only lasted for 5 days, so Donald gave me a 2-hour break on the last day when Hilton came over on this break so we can ride on everything there before the carnival left. We rode everything from the Music Express to the Tornado and every other ride I was thrilling enough for us. During the last few hours before teardown, the temperature really started to drop, and the only warm thing I was wearing was a thin jacket that didn't keep me as warm as it should have. The carnival closed around 10 o'clock that evening, and the last of the lingering crowd finally started departing from the midway. While tearing down our ride, the temperature dropped even more. During the overnight hours, the temperature plummeted into the 30s as we worked all night long, taking the rides apart piece by piece. The freezing weather didn't seem to bother Donald or the rest of the guys because they were all used to it. As for me, who's usually not a fan of cold weather, I was miserable. I kept working, but at the same time, I was shivering to death. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, we were only half done with our ride. Hilton came over to see how I was coming along with tearing down the bumper cars. He asked for my keys so he can go inside and sleep while he waited for me to get done. I threw my keys to him from the rooftop of the bumper car building where I was standing. Hilton headed to my truck and I went back to dismantling the ride. Freezing hours later, we finally finished with our ride as the sun started to come up. I received my final pay and left the parking lot feeling cold, tired, and starving to death. As I walked to my truck, I looked over at the Music Express ride and noticed that it was only halfway torn down. In my mind, I wondered why it looked so familiar as I thought back during my first teardown experience when I saw the Music Express that was halfway taken apart after finishing our ride. I got to my truck and knocked on the window to wake up Hilton so he can open the door. After we left the parking lot, we stopped at a nearby McDonald's to grab some breakfast before we went home. After I dropped off Hilton back at his house, I went home and took a long, hot shower and slept in my bed through half the day. The next weekend, I made plans to take my first drive to Ocean City, Maryland. I decided to take a trip to the beach a little earlier in the season for 2 reasons. 1, so Hilton and I could pay for our room for Memorial Day weekend, and 2, I wanted to see if the Himalaya ride being put together so I could take some pictures for my scrapbook. I didn't expect to see any of the rides open, so I was hoping to take some photos of the Himalaya ride and process of being set up, or perhaps without its tunnel, or maybe some closer photos of the giant mirror ball sitting around somewhere. Who knew? I thought taking photos of the Himalaya being put together would be an excellent addition for my scrapbook. I left the house on a Sunday to pick up Hilton and then started heading toward Route 113 that led us to Milford. I brought along a disposable cameras that I had purchased the day before so I could take pictures of the Himalaya trippers to put in my scrapbook. I couldn't believe I was finally driving to Ocean City, Maryland for the first time. Not only did I feel more independent, I also felt that more confident about remembering the same road my father used to take me when driving me there. I never thought I would see the day that I would drive to Ocean City, Maryland, even though I had constantly had dreams of doing so. I really wanted this day to be a good experience so I could start driving there during the upcoming summer season. We arrived in Ocean City around 2 o'clock that afternoon after we made a detour to the Ocean Manor Hotel to put down my half of the money of our room for the big weekend, which covered Friday and half of Saturday. We found a small parking lot that was walking distance from the amusement park. We got out, fed the parking meter, and had about 4 hours to kill. As we started walking, I suddenly heard music coming from the park. As we walked closer, I noticed that the music was coming from none other than the Himalaya ride, which was actually up and running. In fact, most of the big rides were open that day in addition to the indoor rides. So we went to the nearest booth to purchase some tickets and walked toward the Himalaya. It had been so long since I've ridden an original Himalaya ride, let alone seen one in person, that I wanted to savor every moment possible. There were only 2 people working the ride that day. One was in the booth operating the ride, and the other was showing riders to their seats. As we gave in our tickets and sat in one of the cars, I looked around the ride and noticed that all the original scenery still looked pretty good after being restored a few years previously. The mirror ball looked like it had been worked on, and I noticed that the Himalaya still had the 2 color wheel lights, but it seemed like the color wheels themselves needed some new color gels on them. Other than that, the Himalaya still looked amazing. The ride started a few minutes later, performing its traditional ride cycle as it traveled in reverse, slowly at first, and then gradually picking up speed. Just like my last visit to the ride, its speed only went up to 9 RPMs when in reverse, but as soon as it was time for the ride to go the other way, it sped up to a maximum 12 RPMs. The operator howled onto the microphone, "Sit back and hang on tight as we go real fast." Riding the Himalaya that day felt like old times. It was that same special childhood feeling that I had on the original Himalaya ride that I could never get from any other type of ride, no matter how fast or flashy. The Himalaya only needed a few good lights to make it a spectacular effect and to make the scenery artwork pop, while some of the similar types have a bunch of lights, which is great to a certain point. After the ride ended, I decided to introduce myself to the 2 workers at the ride. First, I met the ride's operator, Simon, as he came out of the booth. I explained to Simon that I had ridden to the park about my interest in the Himalaya ride. Simon then informed me that this particular Himalaya wasn't as fast as it used to be, which I already noticed, but I was still happy to see that ride up and running for so many years. The guy who was working the platforms was Jamie. He also gave me the memo about the ride's lack of speed. His father, Joel, worked at the park as well. He normally operated the Matterhorn ride, but he also worked at the Himalaya at times. I asked him where the main office was so I could introduce myself to them as the Himalaya's biggest fan who had ridden to them a few months back. Simon told me where the office was located. Hilton and I started walking toward the building until we heard a yell, "Yo!" We halted and turned around to see where it was coming. We saw Simon, who called us back over to the ride and told us that we could visit the Himalaya as many times as we wanted from then on out. After receiving such a huge honor, we headed back over toward the office where all the indoor rides was located. The office was on the other side of the building that led to a flight of stairs. Hilton decided to wait for me and let me go on my own. Nervously, I walked up the stairs and knocked on the door. Suddenly, I heard a woman's voice telling me to come on in. I took a deep breath, walked inside, and introduced myself. I told the woman that I was the one who had ridden to the park about being a fan of the Himalaya ride. The woman remembered receiving my email, and I showed her the letter that I had saved in my scrapbook. She shook my hand and told me that it was a pleasure to finally meet me. The woman suggested that I go see a gentleman by the name of Glenn who happens to own the Himalaya. She informed me that he should be at the park and told me that to look for a gentleman wearing a bright yellow shirt and a baseball cap. I left the office and dashed down the stairs where Hilton was waiting for me. I told him that we had to look for someone named Glenn who owned the Himalaya. We searched the whole park high and low until we spotted an older gentleman who was wearing a baseball cap and a bright yellow shirt just like the woman in the office had described. I approached the gentleman who was on his walkie-talkie and asked if his name was Glenn and if he owned the Himalaya ride. Not only had I found the right person, he also revealed that he owned both the Himalaya and the Matterhorn. I introduced myself to Glenn and explained how big a fan I was of the original Himalaya rides like the one he owned, and he shared some of the history of the original Himalaya rides with me. Glenn said that the Himalaya rides were built from a company named Revachon Industries in Saint-Marc, France, which I already knew, but what I didn't know was the Himalaya rides came in 2 different building models. I showed him my scrapbook, which contained photos I found online from the various carnival-related websites. Most of the Himalaya rides in the photos were built differently than the ride he owned. The Himalaya rides that were in my book were designed like the Himalaya ride that used to be at a fair. They were round-scaled and had a string of white lights that were hung over the boarding platforms in front of the ride. There were stairs located on both sides along with fancy railings. Also, the Himalaya sign was in red cursive letters with a small star dotting the I in its name. Glenn explained to me that they were from the original building design. Glenn told me that the Himalaya he owned was called the Grand Design, which was usually built just like the one at the park. The Grand versions were built differently than the original round versions. The sign lettering is in large, rugged letters surrounded by several flashing snowflake decals. Additionally, the stairs were a lot wider and attached to each side of the ride, almost reaching the front. Glenn also revealed something else that I thought was very interesting. He told me that this was the second Himalaya ride that he had purchased. He first bought a Himalaya ride back in the early 1960s, which was when the Himalaya rides were first introduced in the United States by a gentleman named Eddie Meyer from Switzerland. A few years later, Glenn sold that one and bought the one he had now, which was originally built in 1976. Glenn also revealed to me that he bought the ride from a gentleman who was actually traveling with it to different carnivals. With all this new information about the original Himalaya ride, let alone this particular one that I've been riding for years, I was even more excited to tell Glenn that I was a devoted fan. I showed him my charm on my chain as well as my tattoo. Well, I'll be damned, he said. He couldn't believe I was so loyal to the original Himalaya rides built by Revachon. After visiting a few other rides, including the Matterhorn and the Tidal Wave roller coaster, we went back over to the Himalaya. I took photos of the ride, including shots of the tunnel scenery, the color wheel lights, and the crown jewel itself, the large mirror ball in the center of the ride, as well as the smaller mirror ball hanging from the roof. This time when we rode the Himalaya, we ended up getting a much longer ride than usual, which I personally took as some kind of official welcome to a new summer ritual. After the ride was over, I asked Simon if I could take some close-up photos of the artwork inside the tunnel for my scrapbook. After Simon told me to go for it, I went inside the tunnel and took photos of every scenery figure that was painted on that ride, as well as more shots of the center mirror ball. I even took photos of the same thing twice in a row just in case the first picture didn't come out like it should. I took as many photos of the Himalaya as I could until I finally ran out of film. After taking my last pictures of the ride, I met back up with Hilton, who was chatting with both Simon and Jamie. Simon mentioned that the park was about to close. It was about 5 minutes to 6. He told us that the park was only open on weekends until Memorial Day. After the holiday weekend, it would be open every single day from noon to midnight. A few minutes later, Glenn came over to collect the bags of tickets from the Himalaya. Glenn then asked me if I wanted to work for him on his ride, which was something I never expected. Unfortunately, I had to turn down this offer because I lived so far away, but I thanked him right away for even asking me and took the time to tell him about my not-so-friendly experience with the carnival at the mall. I told him that the supervisor didn't give me a chance to tell him about my first experience when I volunteered at the State Fair back in 1997. Glenn patted me on the shoulder and told me that I would have worked out just fine on this ride and I didn't really need any experience. Hearing such a comment from a guy who actually owned my favorite ride of all time was one hell of an honor, which made me forget about everything that happened at the carnival with Johnny. Even though I felt like kicking myself was silly for turning down such an opportunity, not to mention finally having a chance to be in the control booth, I had a feeling in my gut that someday I would eventually get that chance to make that dream happen. It was getting late and the park was closing, so we headed toward the truck and left the resort town. We arrived back in Milford, Delaware around an hour and a half later, where I made a quick stop at a Walmart to drop off my camera and to get my pictures developed. Throughout the rest of the evening after I returned home, I couldn't help but think about my first drive to Ocean City and all the pictures I had taken of the Himalaya. I couldn't wait to see how the photos turned out. The next day, I went back to receive my photos after my first shift at the rink. Before I returned back home from work, I decided to take a sneak peek at my photos to see how they all came out. I opened the envelope, and to my surprise, my photos were crystal clear. I was truly happy with my new photos, and I couldn't wait to put them in my scrapbook. I rushed back home that Monday evening after my second shift and grabbed my scrapbook so I could add my new photos. In one of the photos I had taken of the entire inside view of the ride, I noticed there was something missing, and I just couldn't put my finger on it. I looked closely at the photo, and seconds later it hit me. I noticed in the photo that the colorful lit snowflake decals were missing from the tunnel scenery. I wonder why I hadn't noticed before. Everything else was on the ride, including the spinning color wheel lights, both mirror balls, and the spotlights. Even the strobe light was hooked into the back of the scenery tunnel, so it was a little strange to see the Himalayas tunnel without the snowflakes flashing to the beat of the music. I was so happy with the additions to my scrapbook that I started bringing it with me everywhere I went just so I can show everybody that I knew about my newly added photos. Whether it was over to see a friend or some kind of family get-together, my scrapbook came along with me. Memorial Day weekend finally came, and I couldn't wait to go back to Ocean City for the whole weekend. The original plan was that we would leave Friday afternoon so Hilton could pay his half of the money for our room. 10 minutes before I left the house to pick up Hilton, the phone rang. I answered the phone to find out it was Hilton, who ended up giving me some bad news. He told me that he wasn't able to come up with the rest of the money for a room because he wouldn't be getting his paycheck until later that evening. I was very disappointed at first, but instead of letting the situation put a damper on our weekend plans, we decided to go on Sunday and stay for that one night for which I already paid. Minutes later, I called the hotel explaining to them about my situation. The manager understood my situation and told me since I already paid for one full night, we could stay Sunday and refund me the rest of the money as long as I had the receipt. I thanked the manager and told him that we would be there Sunday afternoon to check in. Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time it was my father who asked if I was busy that weekend. I mentioned that my weekend was postponed until Sunday. My father told me that he and his family were moving to a new house in another part of Dover, and they needed help moving everything into storage. The next day I went over to my father's house where a lot of my other family members came to help them move. The weather on that day wasn't perfect moving weather as it started pouring down rain all throughout the afternoon, but we got the job done. The sun came out the next day as Hilton and I made our way back to the resort town early Sunday afternoon. We went to the hotel where we were staying to receive our key for our room to drop off our bags. After the owner gave us the key, we went up to check out our room. Once I unlocked the door and went in, we noticed that our room looked like a 2-room apartment. The room was divided into 2 separate spaces just like the owner had mentioned during the previous day we had visited. After we were settled in, I grabbed my scrapbook and walked over to the park to visit our 2 new friends, Simon and Jamie, at the Himalaya. I took the time to show them the new photos I shot of their ride. Even Glenn was impressed with my photos. It was cool that we could just visit the Himalaya anytime we wanted, but we also purchased some tickets for the other rides such as Tidal Wave roller coaster, the Zipper, and everything else the park had. In between riding all the rides and making numerous visits to the Himalaya, we took breaks by walking on the boardwalk and talking to girls that we were walking by. Some even asked to hang out with us for a while, which made the weekend even better. Throughout the rest of the evening, we stayed over at the Himalaya where it was packed full of riders and people were standing in line waiting to hop on it. Even though there was a whole lot more in store for us in Ocean City, I personally just couldn't part from the Himalaya for such a long period of time, especially at night when all the lights in the mirror ball were putting on quite a show with loud music blasting from the speakers. The snowflake decals were finally back up and flashing on top of the tunnel scenery, along with the spinning color wheel lights, changing the color of the inside of the ride and the artwork. We rode the Himalaya about 8 to 10 times before the park finally closed around midnight. The next day, it was time for us to check out our room and return the key to the owner. Before we began that long drive back home, I wanted to ride the Himalaya one last time before we left the resort town. We left Ocean City early that afternoon, and as I took a second to take one last look at the Himalaya, I wondered when the next time I would return to ride it again. It was still early in the day when we returned to Delaware, but neither of us was ready to go back home. So we went over to visit a small carnival which was located at the fire hall in Camden, Delaware. This was the second carnival that I had visited Delaware during that year, which was a first for me. Just like the last carnival that was at the mall, this one only had so many rides from which to choose. This carnival had a musical spinning ride that was also called Himalaya, but it wasn't even close to the original ride. This ride was smaller in size and had a square building and a flat roof instead of the round structure and the fancy roof like the original version. Even the cars were different and a whole lot smaller. They fit 2 people instead of 3. This ride was sort of like the smaller built Music Express ride, but with a lot less undulating movement. Instead, the cars move around on a small circular track that looked like speed bumps instead of a traditional 3-hill track. Hill and I didn't really feel like riding on anything, so we just called it an early day. I may have been back home, but my mind was still in Ocean City riding the real Himalaya. I missed the ride so much that I just wasn't in the mood to do anything else for the rest of the day. I knew that I would be returning to Ocean City very soon, however. 2 months later, the State Fair came back into town. That year was the first time I had mixed emotions about attending. I was anxious to go back, but at the same time, I really didn't know what to expect to see when it came to the ride since the fair changed in 1999. Every year it was something different, so I really didn't know what to look forward to that year, but I knew in the back of my mind that I would be in for a surprise. I visited the fair on opening night just like every year, but this time I tried not to take a sneak peek at the midway, especially when I was behind the wheel, which I shouldn't do anyway. After I was guided to the parking spot, I got on my truck and walked toward the midway. I saw some of the rides that had always been there, like the Gravitron, Ring of Fire, the Zipper, etc. But there was one ride that was making its debut at the fair. It was called the Spin Out. The whole ride spun and rotated, including the platform the ride stood on. As I walked to the other side of the midway, I noticed that the Hittin' 2000 wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was the Himalaya ride, but it was the smaller, square-built version that I saw at the small carnival in Camden. What the hell is this? I yelled to myself in shock and disbelief. I never thought I would see the day that these new knockoffs would dare take the place of the original Himalaya ride that I always looked forward to every year as I visited the fair since I was a kid and laid eyes on it for the first time. Now I could see these new versions at the smaller parking lot carnivals, but this was the Delaware State Fair. It was a major event, so I was less than impressed with what I saw. At least the Music Express ride was worth riding a few dozen times, and it was very impressive. However, this ride I wasn't so sure of, but I was willing to see what it could do. As I looked closely at the ride, I noticed that this ride only had a half mirror ball that's set in the center of the ride, which wasn't even half the size of the mirror ball on the original versions. Seconds later, the ride started as I watched. The ride slowly moved forward until it started to pick up speed. Like most original Himalaya rides, this one actually had a siren and a strobe light that attached to the back of the ride's backdrop. But what I didn't expect to hear was a loud horn that scared the living hell out of me. The ride had an air horn normally used in a pickup truck, which I thought was a bit much. I felt that I'd seen enough, so I started to walk around the midway some more to see what the other rides the carnival had brought with it. Throughout the evening, there were people who knew how much of a fan I was of the Himalaya, but who really didn't know the difference between the original version and the particular one that was at the fair that night. Isn't that your favorite ride, they say? and I had to explain to them the difference between the two rides and clarify that I was only a fan of the larger original versions. Later that night, I looked over at the ride and decided to give it a chance. I went back over and gave them my tickets. After being shown to my seat, I noticed that not only the cars were different, but the lap bars were different as well, as they each had padding on them. The ride finally started as the lights dimmed. This version had red and white flashing lights on the ceiling structure and on the sweeps around the half mirror ball in the center of the ride. The lights either flashed, chased, or stayed white, red, or both. There were even lights on the cars, which I thought was pretty decent. All that I was missing were the spotlights for the mirror ball. The ride started to pick up speed as the strobe light flashed brightly and the siren wailed with the air horn. The ride actually went pretty fast, both forward and backward, and it had a fairly impressive set of lights. But it just wasn't the same as the ride in the original Himalaya like the good old days. No other ride could ever take its place. I only went to the fair twice that year. The second time I went, I decided to take a picture of the original Himalaya for my scrapbooks, so it would be easier to explain to my friends who told me about that my favorite ride was there when it really wasn't. Those days of looking forward to riding the original Himalaya at the state fair had come and gone, so I had no choice but to accept it. Even though I didn't get a chance to go to the fair as much as normal due to the rainy weather, I was looking forward to my next drive back to Ocean City to visit the original Himalaya Trimpers. But I didn't have a chance to make my return until the last Sunday of September. I wanted to take my best friend Hilton with me again because he remembered the road back home, which I, on the other hand, didn't. I called Hilton to see if he wanted to go back to Ocean City with me, but unfortunately he was too busy that day. Surprisingly, my mother suggested I go by myself, which was pretty tempting, but in the back of my mind I was afraid that I would forget the way back home. I remember the way there, but I just couldn't remember the turn that took me back to Route 113, which led me to the road back home. I took a minute to give it some thought, and I decided to take a chance and go solo. I left early Sunday afternoon and headed down that familiar road on my way to Ocean City. I was very nervous during my drive, hoping that I wouldn't get lost, but the only problem I had going there was finding a place to park. I wanted to park in the inlet parking lot, but the whole parking lot was closed due to Sunfest that was going on that day, so I had to find somewhere else to park. I ended up going to the same small parking lot from the first trip to the resort town, but it too was full, and I couldn't get a parking spot until someone was leaving. I had to drive around the parking lot until I saw a vehicle getting ready to depart. After a full hour of driving around the same parking lot, feeling frustrated because I knew the park were closed early, and I was already having my time wasted, precious time I planned to use riding the Himalaya. Minutes later, I saw a family who was packing up their belongings inside the vehicle. I waited patiently and put on my signal, telling the driver behind me that I was taking that spot. After finally parking my vehicle, I got out and inserted about 4 quarters into the parking meter and started walking toward the Himalaya, where Simon and Jamie spotted me. Simon asked me where Hilton was as he shook my hand, and I told him that he couldn't make it this time. Simon asked me if I wanted to hop on because he was about to start the ride, which of course I couldn't resist. Simon also suggested that I ride the Himalaya as much as I could because it was the last day in the park, and all the rides, including the Himalaya, would be torn down the next morning. It felt great riding the original Himalaya again, and the thrill came back in full force. As I said before, no matter how fast or flashy another ride may be, there was nothing like riding the original Himalaya after all these years. As I was riding, I thought long and hard about that day I was given the opportunity to work at the Himalaya during the following summer season. After I got off the ride, I asked Simon if he had seen Glenn because I was interested in helping out the Himalaya during the following summer. Simon told me that he didn't really know where he was at the moment, but to keep a lookout because he may be somewhere at the park. But before I took the time to look for Glenn, I had to take Simon's advice and ride the Himalaya as much as I could because it wouldn't be around again until the following spring. After riding the Himalaya a few more times, I spotted Glenn sitting down on a bench in front of the Latin Stamp Funhouse, which was next to the Himalaya. I went up to him as he said hello to me, and I told him that I was interested in helping out the Himalaya that following summer. Glenn told me that he would be very happy to have me at his ride, but he told me to talk to him about it in April. He gave me his home phone number and told me to call him during the following spring so we could talk more about it then. I started to ask Glenn about a place to stay when he suggested that I stay at a place called the Sea Isle Inn, located in West Ocean City. The Sea Isle Inn was where all the workers from the park who were working for the season stayed if they didn't live in Ocean City. I told him that I would call him in April, and I headed back over to the Himalaya. Simon asked me how everything went with Glenn, and I told him about everything he had said, including his suggestion about staying at the Sea Isle Inn. Simon told me that staying there would be my best bet, but he also mentioned that he wouldn't let me stay at his house, but he already had enough roommates, including his girlfriend, so he didn't have room for anybody else. While Simon waited for more people to board his ride, we kept shooting the breeze. He told me a little bit more about himself, including outside his job. Simon revealed that he wanted to become a music artist, and he'd been working on his music for some time now. He told me that he would invite me over to his house to listen to some of his music the next time I came to visit the park. As I wished him luck with his future, Glenn came back over to the ride and told Simon to give it one last spin because it was nearly closing time. Simon told me that this would be the last ride, so I hopped on one last time before I hit that long road back to Frederica, Delaware. Simon ran the ride a little bit longer this time because he knew it was the last ride and I was riding, so he made sure I savored every moment of the Himalaya as much as I could. The ride finally came to an end, as did the entire park, and everybody started to shut everything down. I told Glenn and Simon that I would see them in April, and I couldn't wait to come back for the summer to help out at the Himalaya. I went back to my vehicle and I took a moment to take one last look at the Himalaya before driving down that long road to Frederica. I had walked back to the parking lot with the perfect timing because my minutes was almost up on the parking meter. I got inside my vehicle, got out of that parking lot as soon as I could, and left the resort town while hoping and praying that I remembered the turn that led me back to Route 113. As I reached the bridge, I saw a sign that was supposed to lead me back to Dover, Delaware. I took that road, but suddenly I had a weird feeling that it wasn't the same road that I usually took, and it damn sure didn't look like Route 113. Nothing on that road looked familiar, so I started to panic a little until I found a convenience store where I spotted a police car. Now, I don't usually ask for directions, but this was my first experience driving to Ocean City alone, and I was in the spot, so I really didn't care to take any more chances. I asked the cop how to get back to Route 113 going north to Dover, Delaware. The cop gave me the directions, and before I knew it, I was on that familiar road when my appetite started to come back. So I stopped at a nearby McDonald's before heading back home. After I finally made it home, I continued to fantasize about being part of the Himalaya crew and maybe finally have a chance to be inside the control booth operating the ride for the first time. And there you have it. That was chapter 15. Hope you enjoyed it so far. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and let me know what you think. And if you'd like to buy my book, you can buy it on Amazon or my online store, along with tons of Himalaya fan-based merch. I'll be back on here next month with chapter 16. So as we say in the Himalaya world, keep that mirror ball spinning. Take care.